Commitment to Ukraine will not weaken. We will stand for liberty and freedom today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes.
Welcome back to America Decides. President Biden, he sure hasn't been shy about his commitment to Ukraine in its war with Russia. Joining us now is Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator, thanks for being here.
Great to be on with you, Bob. Thanks for the chance.
Senator, you're a confidant of President Biden, a longtime leader on foreign policy in the United States Senate. What's your latest assessment of where Ukraine stands in terms of joining NATO?
Well, Ukraine is stronger today than it was before the Vilnius summit. President Zelensky came and got commitments to closer consultation, to continued robust military and economic support, and to a future pathway. He did not get the explicit timeline for an invitation to join NATO that he was seeking, but both in his bilateral meeting with our president and in his meeting with the other heads of state of the 31 current NATO members, I am confident that President Zelensky left encouraged and strengthened as Ukraine continues its counteroffensive to push out the Russian occupiers of eastern and southern Ukraine.
How much assurance did he get from President Biden?
Well, I wasn't in the conversation, Bob, but I am confident that he got strong assurances of continued financial and military support. As you know, Ukraine's in the middle of a war, which means that there was no chance that we would admit Ukraine to NATO right now. But the pathway towards NATO membership requires Ukraine to make a number of important reforms and improvements to their rule of law, their media, their electoral process, and their economy for admission to the EU, which is a critical first step. They also need to upgrade their military, their equipment, their platforms, their training, which is underway as a part of NATO, providing members of NATO providing critical resources and military platforms. So I think President Zelensky can see a clear path towards future NATO membership on the far side of this war. But frankly, he needs to first win this war, and we need to continue providing the critical military and economic support that'll make that possible.
And what's your view of how long this war could last?
It could last a long time, but frankly, it will be shorter the more we continue to provide the training, the equipment, and the support that those who are fighting and dying bravely on the front lines in Ukraine deserve. I was recently in Europe on a bipartisan delegation trip. We met with leaders of both the EU and NATO, and I was struck, Bob, that the numbers are roughly this, that other than the United States, all the other members of NATO have delivered about $72 billion in support for Ukraine. The United States has so far delivered about $77 billion, very close. There are 47 countries, NATO allies and other partners around the world supporting Ukraine in its fight. The United States needs to stay the course. Our partners and allies need to stay the course. And the more we deliver and the faster we get it to the front lines, the more likely it is that this war will end sooner.
Senator, as you know, this is not just playing out in Europe as a discussion. It's also playing out as the 2024 presidential campaign unfolds. Former President Trump and other Republicans seem to have some reservations about President Biden's policy on Ukraine. Do you believe Democrats will be able to make a convincing case to the American people in the next year about sustaining this policy on Ukraine?
I do, and it enjoys bipartisan support here in the Senate. Frankly, I am grateful that today, as the heads of state from all across Europe and North America, all of the NATO allies are gathering in Vilnius, that our president is someone who is a seasoned leader on the world stage with decades of experience. The former president called Vladimir Putin a genius and was more interested in currying favor with Vladimir Putin than he was with being close or closer to our NATO allies. The contrast between the chaos that former President Trump caused in our alliances and our relationships and the ways in which President Biden, particularly in his successful leadership around the war in Ukraine, has pulled NATO closer together, has helped support the expansion of NATO, and has strengthened NATO, and thus delivered a strategic defeat to Vladimir Putin. That contrast could not be sharper. And I believe the average American still believes in freedom and still believes it's important that the United States stand shoulder to shoulder with the allies who have helped make us more secure and more prosperous over the nearly 75 years of the NATO alliance.
So many presidents, Senator, as you know, when they run for a second term, they talk about their efforts on foreign policy, but domestic policy so often dominates presidential campaigns. There's a new CPI report out today saying inflation is cooling across the United States, but there are polls that show the president's approval numbers sagging in many parts of this country. Will the president, this White House, your party, be able to convince voters that their program on the economy is actually breaking through on these issues like inflation?
Yes, Bob, because the reality on the ground is steadily getting better. First, as for polling, I'll remind you that in the run-up to the midterms in 2022, President Biden's approval rating was roughly where it is now, and yet he had the most successful first midterm of any president in 9 decades. Second, he was just at a groundbreaking in South Carolina for a new state-of-the-art advanced manufacturing plant. There are new manufacturing plants, new infrastructure projects coming online all over this country, in Pennsylvania and Arizona, in Georgia and Texas, in South Carolina and Illinois, because of bipartisan legislation like the infrastructure law or legislation that only Democrats supported, like the Inflation Reduction Act, that are pouring investments into communities all over our country. Joe Biden's view on economics is fundamentally different from former President Trump's or most Republicans. Instead of supporting tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans or the most profitable companies and hoping that somehow that trickles down, where instead over decades mostly they've shipped jobs overseas, President Biden's approach is to invest in America and rebuild our country from the middle out.
You mentioned President Biden going to South Carolina. One of your colleagues, Senator Joe Manchin, is going to another early voting state next week to have an event with no labels. Most Democrats seem to be united behind President Biden. Do you think it's a good or bad move for Senator Manchin to be going to New Hampshire and having this event with no labels?
Look, Senator Manchin and I were sworn in on the same day. We've served alongside each other for 13 years, and we're friends. And I understand that Senator Manchin is exploring his options, whether to run for re-election to the Senate in West Virginia, consider retirement, or consider this other path. I dearly hope and pray that he will run for re-election to the Senate. He is a very talented West Virginia politician, probably the only Democrat who could hold that seat in the Senate. And when he has teamed up with the president and they have delivered legislative results for West Virginia and the American people, it's been very positive. He will not ultimately be successful if he runs for president, although there are millions of Americans who would like an independent candidate or a third-party candidate. They are very, very far from a majority. And in the end, I hope he chooses the path where he will most be successful, which is re-election to his seat here in the United States Senate.
Senator Chris Coons, thank you for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob.